a police officer slapped a black woman across the face on the very steps of a courthouse built to protect justice. He laughed. He cuffed her. He called her an animal that belonged in a cage. What he didn't know was that the woman he humiliated wasn't just anybody.
You're just an
She was
animal
Judge
that
Alana
belongs in a
Brooks,
cage.
the presiding judge of this courthouse, the very woman with the power to take away his badge, his career, and his freedom. This isn't just the story of a slap. This is the story of a system unmasked and how justice hit back harder than he ever imagined. You're watching Black Voice Matter, where untold stories of power, prejudice, and truth come to light. Stay with us, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Rain slicked the stone steps of the Barton County Courthouse. The morning light hadn't broken through yet, just the pale glow of street lamps on the mist. Papers lay scattered across the wet ground, their ink bleeding in the rain. A single ID badge floated face down in a shallow puddle, its lanyard swaying in the wind. The woman reached for it, but her arm was forced back against the wall. Her hand trembled. Yet her eyes stayed locked on the bronze letters above the courthouse doors. Not the eyes of a victim. The eyes of someone memorizing every detail, every insult, every second, knowing the truth would not stay buried forever. Her name is Alana Brooks, and this morning a single act of violence would force an entire system to face itself. The rain kept falling, washing ink from legal documents across the stone. Strangers passed by, some curious, some pretending not to see. One woman whispered to her child to look away. Another man shook his head, as if this scene was nothing new. And yet, in the middle of that silence, Alana Brooks stood still. Her cheeks stung, her wrists ached from the cuffs, but her eyes, they burned with memory. Because she knew this wasn't just about her. If justice itself could be slapped down in public, what did that mean for everyone else who walked these steps without a robe, without a title, without protection? That question would soon shake this courthouse, and the nation beyond it. The morning air was damp, heavy with the smell of rain on stone. The courthouse loomed ahead, columns slick, steps shining dark under a gray Carolina sky. Alana Brooks adjusted the collar of her coat, a briefcase tucked beneath her arm. Inside, case files, memoranda, and the familiar weight of responsibility. She was used to mornings like this. She was used to walking up these steps unseen, but not unknowing. Her eyes traced the bronze letters above the door. Barton County Courthouse. For her, those words meant duty. For some others, they meant power. Then, a figure stepped into her path. Sergeant Daniel Crowley, broad-shouldered, a scowl carved deep into his face, one hand resting on his duty belt, the other raised slightly as if claiming ownership of the space. "Morning?" Alana said softly, shifting her briefcase. Crowley's gaze dropped to her coat, her skin, the edges of her hair damp from rain. His lip curled. "You people, always showing up like you belong here." His words were flat, not shouted, not cruel on the surface, but loaded, weighted with history. Voice low, uncertain. "Sergeant, she's just walking in," murmured Officer Tyler McKee, the younger one, still fresh to the force. Crowley didn't break his stare. "Protocol, McKee. Don't teach me my job." Behind them, Officer Brian Soto lifted his phone. "Habit, insurance, record a few seconds, just in case." Alana tightened her grip on the briefcase. She'd heard variations of that phrase her whole life. "You people." Not a curse word, but an accusation. A reminder that she was seen first by color, never by name. She took a breath, steady. "Sergeant, I have business inside. Please step aside." Crowley moved faster than she expected. A flash of movement, his palm cracked against her cheek. The sound echoed off wet stone. Her head snapped sideways. The briefcase split open. Papers burst free, sliding across the rain-slick steps. And in the mess, a corner of a document glistened with the seal of judicial chambers. But the rain blurred it, ink bleeding into grey. Crowley's hand clamped down on her wrist. The cold bite of cuffs snapped shut. Metal against skin. McKee froze, eyes wide, mouth half open, every part of him screaming, "This isn't right!" But his boots stayed planted. Soto's phone stayed raised, recording, not to protect her, to protect himself. Alana's jaw burned from the slap. But inside, something steadied, the training of years, the discipline of the bench. A voice in her head, calm, detached. Breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth, catalogue details, his words, his grip, the time, the place, the rain. Because one day all of this would matter. From across the plaza, Rome Patterson, the courthouse bailiff, spotted the struggle. His pace quickened, boots splashing through puddles. Recognition hit him like a punch. He knew that silhouette, that walk, that briefcase. "Judge!" he shouted, but the word was lost in the storm. By the time he reached the steps, the cuffs were already tight. Too late. Alana lifted her eyes. The rain blurred the world, but not the letters above her. Barton County Courthouse. She'd sworn an oath inside those doors, to uphold justice, to protect the very system now turned against her. And as Crowley shoved her forward, her breath steadied. Not the gasp of a victim, but the quiet rhythm of someone who understood that survival sometimes meant silence. For now. Beat softer. Because silence isn't surrender. Sometimes silence is the blade you keep hidden until the right moment. The scene might have looked ordinary to a stranger. A cop doing his job. A woman resisting protocol. That's how the narrative usually gets written. But if you look closer, if you freeze the frame, you'd see the truth in her eyes. Not fear, but calculation. History has seen this before. In Birmingham, in Selma, in Ferguson. Power used like a weapon. Always justified. Always written as necessary. Dr. King once said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And here, on these courthouse steps, that threat had a face, a badge, and a name. Daniel Crowley. The slap was not just skin meeting skin. It was history colliding with the present. It was the echo of centuries when law was not a shield, but a chain. But chains can break. And systems, when forced into the light, can crack wide open. Crowley tightened his grip on the cuffs. Animals like this don't belong on courthouse steps, he muttered, almost to himself. McKee flinched. Soto kept filming, and Patterson, heart-hammering, broke into a run. But Alana... She lifted her chin, looked past Crowley, past Soto, past McKee. Her eyes fixed on the words carved in stone above the doors. Barton County Courthouse. The place where she belonged. The place where truth would one day find its voice. And in that moment, something awakened. Not rage, not despair, but resolve. That slap was just the beginning. Inside the courthouse, a story was already being written, one of lies, cover-ups, and a system designed to protect its own. In Chapter 2, we step into the courtroom, where words become weapons, and the battle for truth begins. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut behind them. Rain still clung to Alana's coat, dripping onto the polished floor. Her wrists, raw from the cuffs, were locked tightly in front of her. She was led forward, not to the bench where she had spent years commanding order, but to the defendant's chair. That chair, the one reserved for thieves, hustlers, the desperate and the broken, was now hers. Behind the prosecutor's table stood Assistant District Attorney Melissa Crane. Her suit pressed sharp, her posture crisp. She had prosecuted 100 arraignments like this. Her face betrayed nothing, just another morning docket. She didn't know. Not yet. At the witness stand, Sergeant Daniel Crowley straightened his uniform. His jaw set with practiced resolve. The performance was about to begin. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth, steady, almost rehearsed. The subject was acting erratically, refused to provide identification. She posed a potential security threat to the courthouse. Those words. Erratic. Refused to comply. Security threat. Buzzwords. Scripted phrases carried from case to case. Each one a brushstroke painting a target. Each one bending the truth into a narrative the system knew by heart. This is what scholars call narrative policing. The art of describing someone in ways that make guilt sound inevitable. Officer McKee was called next. His voice trembled slightly. "Yes, I observed the subject behaving suspiciously." She resisted standard protocol. But his eyes darted toward Alana. Her cheeks still bruised, her wrists marked red. The words caught in his throat. A pause. Then he pushed them out anyway. Not because he believed them, but because he was terrified of contradicting his superior. Then came Officer Brian Soto. Calm, measured, calculated. "For officer safety," he said flatly, "we documented the encounter as per procedure. Everything was handled appropriately." For officer safety. Another phrase with a life of its own, so often used that the public hardly questions it anymore. Across the room, Tanya Reed, the court clerk, lowered her pen. Her eyes lingered on Alana's face, the bruise blooming purple across her cheekbone. She had worked under Judge Brooks for years. She knew the cadence of her voice, the way she held herself with quiet dignity. And now, seeing her shackled in the defendant's chair, something inside Tanya shifted. Suspicion. Anger. But most of all, resolve. The stenographer's keys clicked rapidly, preserving every false syllable for the record. It struck Alana like a bitter irony. The very system meant to preserve truth was now chiseling lies into permanence. She kept her gaze steady, breathing measured, counting silently as each accusation was stacked like bricks in a wall meant to bury her. Erratic, non-compliant, threatening, the same recycled vocabulary that had condemned so many others before her. She thought of names: Trayvon, Sandra, George, Brianna, each a life swallowed by a story crafted in a police report. A quote from James Baldwin whispered through her mind: "The most dangerous creation of any society is the man who has nothing to lose." But here, the danger was not the accused, it was the officer, armed with both a badge and a narrative. From the back of the courtroom, footsteps echoed. The atmosphere shifted. Chief Judge Lorraine Whitaker entered, robes flowing. Her presence alone demanded silence. She scanned the room, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. The uniformed officers lined in solidarity, the prosecutor nodding in rhythm with their testimony, and Alana Brooks, a federal judge, seated in chains like a criminal. Whitaker's brow furrowed. Her voice cut clean through the air. "Hold these proceedings." The courtroom stilled. She turned first to Ada Crane. "Ms. Crane, who authorized this arraignment?" Crane hesitated. "Your Honor, we were acting on sworn statements from law enforcement officers." Whitaker raised a hand. "Enough." Her gaze shifted to Alana. Recognition flickered, a bruise on her face, a dignity that even handcuffs could not erase. Something wasn't right, and Chief Judge Whitaker knew it. "Proceedings are suspended," she declared. "This matter requires verification. We will not move forward until proper identification and context are confirmed." The gavel struck, a sound that usually meant finality, but now carried the promise of revelation. Alana exhaled slowly, her hands still bound, her cheek still burning, but her mind sharper than ever, for in that pause she felt the first crack appear in Crowley's carefully built wall of lies. And cracks, if pressed long enough, become fractures, and fractures can bring down an entire structure. The wall of lies had been laid brick by brick, but now the foundation was beginning to tremble. In Chapter 3, the truth steps out of the shadows, and the system that tried to bury her is forced to recognize who she really is. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud. The echo lingered in the narrow hallway that ran behind the courtroom. Here, away from the audience, away from the press, silence pressed harder than the rain outside. Rome Patterson, the bailiff, still breathing hard from his sprint, leaned close to the court clerk. "Tanya, go. Find me her chambers file. Now." His voice shook, not from fear of Crowley, but from recognition. He knew that face. He'd seen it in robes, behind the bench, commanding the very courtroom they had just left. Tanya froze for a second. "Wait, you mean—" Rome only nodded. She didn't ask again. Her heels clicked against the tile as she rushed down the corridor. Inside the judge's chambers, Chief Judge Lorraine Whitaker stood at the center of the room. She was seasoned, silver-haired, the kind of presence that bent rooms into order just by entering them. Now she turned to the woman in cuffs. Her eyes narrowed. She whispered, half shock, half recognition. "Judge Brooks?" No gavel, no outburst, just a quiet recognition that hit harder than any shout. Alana met her gaze. For the first time since the slap, emotion broke through the calm. Her chin dipped slightly. "Yes." The word was soft, but it shook the air. Whitaker's hands tightened on the edge of the desk. "Good Lord. Remove those cuffs, immediately." Rome hurried to obey. Metal fell away. The red marks around Alana's wrists looked raw, angry against her skin. Whitaker exhaled sharply, as if trying to push the disbelief out of her lungs. A sitting judge, assaulted on courthouse steps, dragged into her own courtroom. Her voice carried the weight of both outrage and sorrow. "This changes everything." Alana's inner voice, calm, restrained. "Does it? Or will the machine find another way to bury me?" Because she knew the system. Knew how many times complaints were labeled unsubstantiated. Knew how often truth died quietly in the paperwork. Whitaker turned to Ada Melissa Crane, who had entered behind them. "Ms. Crane, do you understand what just happened here?" Crane's face paled. She adjusted her glasses, buying time. I see the gravity, Your Honor, but politically, this is a nightmare. The press, the unions, the council." Whitaker cut her off. "Politics be damned! We're talking about the integrity of this court." At that moment, Chief Robert Kinlan, head of the Barton Police Department, burst in, his phone pressed to his ear. He was red-faced, sweat beading despite the cool rain outside. "Lorraine, let's be reasonable. Crowley's a decorated sergeant. We can smooth this. I'll make some calls." Whitaker's voice sliced clean. "No, you will not. This case is not yours to massage, not anymore." Kinlan froze. For the first time in years, someone had shut the door on his leverage. A new voice entered the room. Calm, steady, measured. "I'm afraid she's right." Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Special Agent in Charge Marcus Ellison, FBI Civil Rights Division. Tall, composed, eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. He held up a leather folder. "Effective immediately. This is a federal matter. I'm opening a civil rights case. Preservation orders are being filed for all surveillance, CCTV, body cams, server logs. No evidence leaves this building. The room went silent. Crowley's narrative, built on buzzwords and bravado, had just met federal teeth. Alana sat quietly in the corner chair, fingers grazing the swelling on her cheek. Outwardly composed. Inside, a storm. She thought of her mother's words decades ago. Don't let them see you break. If they see you crack, they'll call it weakness. If you hold steady, they'll call it defiance. But either way, they'll call it something. Now she felt both truths colliding in her chest. Tanya rushed back into the room, clutching a leather folder marked Chambers, Honor Alana Brooks. She handed it to Whitaker, who opened it with trembling hands. Photographs, credentials, court schedules, proof beyond doubt. Whitaker closed the folder slowly. The room seemed to exhale with her. This court cannot handle its own case when the victim sits on this very bench, she declared. Judge Brooks, you are recused. A special prosecutor will be appointed immediately. Ada Crane swallowed hard. Her career calculations ran faster than her words. If the public sees this as bias or retaliation against law enforcement, Whitaker didn't let her finish. The public will see justice, that is all. Sayek Ellison placed the folder on the table with finality. You'll have your special prosecutor within the hour. Washington is already moving. Later that evening, the name arrived. Priya Desai. Sharp, relentless, with a reputation for peeling lies down to the bone. She would carry the case forward. Alana only nodded when she heard. There was relief, yes. But also weight, because she knew this meant stepping back. She would not be the architect of her own vindication. She would simply be a witness. And that truth, though necessary, cut deep. At home that night, Alana stood before the bathroom mirror. The bruise on her cheek, now dark purple, stared back at her. She opened her compact, dabbed foundation across the swelling, layer after layer, until the skin tone looked even. Her teenage daughter knocked on the door. "Mum, you okay?" Alana forced a smile into her voice. "Fine, baby. Just tired. Long day." The lie hurt almost as much as the slap. She closed the compact with a snap, looked at her own reflection, and whispered to herself, "Hold steady." Because she knew the battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. Sometimes the heaviest price of justice isn't in the courtroom. It's in the silence you keep at home. The mask of professionalism had cracked. The slap was no longer just an assault. It was a federal case. And as the narrative spilled beyond the courthouse walls, the media, the unions, and the public would soon take sides. In Chapter 4, we enter the storm outside, how stories are spun, how truth is bent, and how communities rise to demand answers. The story did not stay locked in the courthouse. By sunrise, it had spilled into the streets, the screens, the headlines. News vans lined the curb outside Barton County Courthouse. Cameras swiveled like predators, hungry for every angle. What had begun as a slap was now a national firestorm. Nora Patel, an investigative journalist known for her persistence, pieced together a timeline. She traced Crowley's career, the arrests, the complaints, the unsubstantiated files buried in internal affairs. Her article leaked details the department had long hoped would stay hidden. 47 complaints, most dismissed, most from black and brown residents. Her voice carried through a podcast that morning. Patterns don't lie. When one man's name appears again and again on civil rights complaints, the question is not if the system failed, but how often. The story went viral. Screens across America lit up with Crowley's face, side by side with words like bias, brutality, cover-up. But the police union moved fast. Within hours, a podium was set up. Blue flags draped, microphones clustered. The union rep stepped forward, his tone rehearsed, firm. Officer safety, due process, these are not negotiable. He spoke of stress, of danger, of how officers make split-second decisions, how the public could not possibly understand the risks of the badge. Behind him, a row of officers nodded solemnly. The message was clear. The real victim was not Judge Brooks. It was the police themselves. This is how narrative battles are fought. On one side, facts, documents, bruises. On the other, symbols, fear, and the powerful machinery of unions. And in living rooms across America, viewers sat between the two versions of reality, wondering which one to believe. But on the east side of town, another gathering was underway. Not in front of cameras, but in the heart of the community. Inside a church basement, folding chairs circled under dim lights. The air smelled of coffee and candle wax. Reverend Caleb Turner, tall and steady, lifted his hands for silence. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "we've been here before, stopped on streets for no reason, searched without cause, silenced when we spoke." One by one, people rose to share. A truck driver describing the night he was pulled over 3 times on the same road. A college student remembering the cuffs, the humiliation, for a broken taillight that wasn't broken at all. Their voices cracked, but their stories were steady. Each one a mirror of what happened to Alana. Alana herself was not there. She was at home, recovering, silent. But her name filled the room. The Reverend's voice carried over the crowd. Justice does not live in courtrooms alone. It lives in us. And if we let them bury one of us, we let them bury all of us. Applause rose, not thunderous, but determined. Meanwhile, in universities and law schools, professors dusted off doctrines once confined to textbooks. Unconscious bias. The invisible lens through which officers perceive threat. The way a wallet can look like a gun, a question like defiance, a step forward like aggression. And then came Brady and Giglio, 2 Supreme Court precedents most Americans had never heard of. Brady, prosecutors must hand over evidence favorable to the defense. Giglio, if an officer's credibility is tainted, every case they touch is compromised. Crowley's name was now under that shadow. And with it, dozens, maybe hundreds of prosecutions could collapse. The system had not just hurt Alana Brooks, it had poisoned itself. Because if a witness in uniform cannot be trusted, then the badge on his chest carries no weight in court. That night, Alana sat alone in her study. A single lamp lit the desk. The house was quiet, her family asleep. She picked up a small recorder, her private journal, her voice low, intimate, confessional. Today I saw how quickly truth becomes a debate, not about facts, but about power. I watched unions spin fear. I watched neighbors cry out in memory. And I thought about the oath we take, to serve justice, not ourselves. She paused. The silence hummed on tape. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "Justice isn't just a verdict. It's the trust people place in us. And tonight, that trust feels fragile." The tape clicked off. The night pressed in. And somewhere in the city, headlines refreshed, cameras rolled, arguments sharpened. Because the fight was no longer about one slap. It was about what America saw in its own reflection. By morning, the storm had grown louder. The courtroom was no longer just a legal stage. It was a theater of national reckoning. In Chapter 5, the fight moves inside again, where evidence collides with spin and the cracks in the system widen for all to see. The storm outside had calmed. But inside Barton County, another storm was rising. One made of data, logs, and evidence that refused to stay silent. In a secured FBI operations room, screens lit up in rows. Special Agent in Charge Marcus Ellison stood with his arms crossed. Around him, a small technical team typed furiously. On one screen, courthouse CCTV feeds. On another, body cam backups pulled from cloud servers. A third showed GPS tracks from patrol vehicles that morning. "Chain of custody locked?" Ellison asked. "Locked and documented," replied a technician. "Every file, every packet, every timestamp preserved." This was more than an investigation. It was a digital autopsy. The first breakthrough came from metadata. One camera feed, labeled CAM07, carried a timestamp Crowley had claimed didn't exist. Frame by frame, the slap appeared. Alana's head jerking sideways, her papers scattering. Crowley's hand raised, not in defense, but in dominance. The machine didn't lie. The metadata lined up to the second with her arrival log at the courthouse gates. Ellison leaned in. "Freeze here. Zoom the reflection." In a rain puddle, faint but visible, the outline of McKee's face watching. Proof he was present. Proof he couldn't deny. Next came the interviews. Officer McKee sat across from federal agents, hands clasped tight. The room was plain. A recorder blinked red. "Officer McKee, you understand you're speaking under Garrity." The agent began. "That means your statements here can't be used criminally against you, but lying will end your career." McKee swallowed. His voice cracked. I didn't stop it. I should have, but Crowley, he controls everything. He writes the reports. He decides who belongs, who doesn't." The shame in his voice was louder than his words. Then came Officer Soto. Colder, sharper, calculating. "I followed protocol," he said flatly. "Crowley was the lead. I documented for officer safety." His answers were clipped. Every phrase sounded rehearsed, like lines pulled from a manual. When pressed about what he saw, his eyes narrowed. "I didn't see anything inconsistent with training," he repeated. Word for word, the same phrase he'd used in 3 prior IA cases. The agents noted it. Patterns were beginning to surface. Meanwhile, agents canvassed the plaza. Witnesses described the rain, the shout, the slap. One woman clutched her phone, trembling. "I deleted the video. I was scared they'd find it." The tech team recovered it from her cloud backup. And there it was, another angle. The sound of the slap, the insult that followed. The collective gasp of strangers too afraid to intervene. Back in the operations room, analysts mapped every piece into a 3D reconstruction. The steps, the angles, the positions of each officer, each camera, each bystander. On screen, a digital Alana approached the courthouse. Crowley blocked her. The slap, the grab, the cuffs, the model played and replayed. Undeniable. The evidence was painting its own story, but the most damning pattern didn't come from video. It came from Crowley's own words. Agents pulled 2 decades of reports he had filed. Each one scanned, digitized, run through text analysis. Over and over the same phrases appeared. Erratic behavior. Furtive movement. Officer feared for his life. Like a script, like a template copied and pasted onto dozens of defendants, most of them people of color. A civil rights expert later remarked, "When language becomes that predictable, it's not description, it's choreography." Ellison stared at the report wall. "This isn't one incident," he muttered. "This is a system speaking through him." Internal affairs files were unsealed. Again and again, cases against Crowley had been closed with the same note. Unsubstantiated. Behind closed doors, officers had been questioned under garrity warning, shielded from prosecution. Their words locked in administrative files, never reaching court. A mechanism meant to protect constitutional rights had been twisted into a wall against accountability. The files revealed a pattern: complaints dismissed, witnesses ignored, officers cleared. Every time. For Alana, reading those files felt like walking through a cemetery of truth. Each page, another voice silenced. Each dismissal, another reminder of what happens when power protects itself. She whispered under her breath. How many names were lost in these reports before mine? By week's end, Special Prosecutor Priya Desai stepped before a press pool. Her tone was precise, her words clipped with purpose. The evidence gathered demonstrates systemic misconduct. The grand jury will be convened to review charges. Our roadmap includes civil rights violations, perjury, and obstruction of justice. Flashes popped. Reporters shouted questions. Desai only added one more line. No one is above the law, not even those sworn to enforce it. Alana watched from home, her face still tender under makeup, her children in the next room, laughing at the television. She muted the screen. Her hand lingered on her cheek. And she thought of all the people who never got this far, whose bruises healed, but whose stories never did. Because evidence doesn't just speak, it remembers, it preserves, and when given the chance, it tells the truth louder than any badge or uniform ever could. The evidence was in place, the pattern undeniable. But justice isn't only won in data rooms and grand jury plans. It's tested under pressure, in the courtroom, against the very machinery built to resist it. In Chapter 6, the system fights back. And the question becomes, will the truth be enough? The law loves ceremony, but the grand jury loves silence. No cameras, no audience, no defense cross-examination. Just citizens, sworn to secrecy, listening to the weight of evidence behind a heavy wooden door. A placard read, "No entry." Inside, truth would either breathe or suffocate. Special Prosecutor Priya Desai stood before the panel. Calm, precise. Her binders were color-tabbed, gold for video, blue for reports, red for credibility. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, voice even, "you are here to decide whether probable cause exists to indict, not to convict, to ask one narrow question. Is there enough here to move this case forward?" A nod from the foreperson. Desai gestured to the first screen. Witness 1. Use of force, expert courthouse CCTV, rain glossing the stone. A woman approaches, briefcase, measured stride. A uniformed man steps into her path. The frame paused on the raised hand mid-arc. The room was quiet enough to hear the projector fan. Desai didn't narrate the slap. She didn't need to. Timecode synchronized with building access logs, she said instead. Chain of custody documented, metadata preserved. A juror exhaled through her teeth. The sound was small. It felt enormous. Exhibit B, the badge in the puddle-zoomed reflection in a rain pool. A blurred oval, an ID badge face down, a lanyard drifting. Enhancement reveals the embossing Chambers, the technician testified. Additional frames show the seal briefly upright before water distortion. The foreperson leaned forward. Is that typical for a defendant's paperwork? Not unless your defendants carry judicial calendars. Desai replied dryly. A few jurors exchanged glances. Assumptions were unclenching. Witness 1. Use of force expert retired captain. 30 years, training division. He spoke in steady, teacherly beats. Use of force must be necessary and proportional. Here, the subject's hands are visible, posture non-aggressive, no threat cues, no blading, no weight shift, no arm load up. The strike you see is not a defensive reaction, it's domination. He tapped a printed still. Also note the pre-assault indicators from the officer. Stance closes distance, hand pre-positions on the target plane. That's initiation. Conclusion? Desai asked. Unjustified strike. No articulable threat. Words like bricks, witness 2, forensic linguist, a scholar with soft vowels and hard data. Her slides were a lattice of language. We analyzed 15 years of Sergeant Crowley's reports. She began. Key phrases recur at statistically impossible rates when compared to department baselines. On the screen, a word cloud hardening into numbers. Erratic 4.7x baseline, furtive movement 6.3x baseline, officer feared for his life 5.1x baseline. These aren't descriptions, she said. They're templates. A juror frowned. Templates for what? For transforming ambiguity into threat, on paper. She paused. And once a threat exists on paper, everything that follows can be justified. The panel's pens scratched, then stopped. No one wanted to miss the quiet of what she'd just said. Witness 3. Officer Tyler McKee Young uniform, knuckles white, Garrity protections explained on the record. He cleared his throat. Looked like he wanted to run, and knew there was nowhere left to go. Tell the jury what you saw. Desai said, gentle but pinned. McKee stared at the screen frozen on the slap, then down at his hands. I saw the seal, he managed, voice shaking. On the paper, on the steps, Chambers. I knew it meant she belonged there. A beat. So why didn't you intervene? Desai asked. Silence pulsed. Because I was afraid, he whispered. Afraid of crossing the sergeant, afraid of losing my job. I told myself I didn't know enough, but I did. It landed like confession, not performance. Did you sign a report repeating erratic, non-compliant, security threat? Desai asked. He nodded, tears held but visible. I'm sorry, that's not what I saw. In that room, without audience, without applause, courage looked like a trembling voice that didn't break. Witness 4. Officer Brian Soto Colder posture. Eyes flat. He asked to speak through counsel, then thought better of it. Desai kept to rails. Officer, you submitted a sworn statement that the subject resisted protocol and that the incident was handled per training. Correct? Yes. Desai lifted a tablet. Is this your personal cloud account? Soto hesitated. Yes. Exhibit C. Desai said. On the screen, a private clip, pulled from an autosync folder he hadn't known still lived in the cloud. Audio tinny, laughter cruel. Soto's own voice. Crowley's on one, teaching lessons today. A second voice, unseen. Who is she? Soto again, half joke, half truth. Who cares? She'll learn her place. The room chilled. Officer Soto, Desai said, tone flat as winter. Does that sound like a safety protocol? Or a mindset? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The union attorney, he wore a navy suit that read, reasonable. He spoke the language of caution. Context, ladies and gentlemen. Weather conditions, visibility, split-second judgment. Officer safety isn't a slogan. It's survival. Reports reflect perceptions at the time. Hindsight is not a legal standard. He paced like a metronome. Grand juries should not criminalize officers for imperfect situations. What looks like certainty in a frame-by-frame analysis was chaos in real time. A few jurors nodded, until Desai rose. She didn't attack the speech. She narrowed the aperture. Counselor, is erratic a medical term? She asked. No. Furtive movement? A descriptor. Feared for his life? Subjective, yes? Of course. Then let's pair words with physics. She said, tapping the screen. Distance, angle, timing. Where is the threat queue? Right here, just before the strike. Silence. He didn't point, because there wasn't one. Alana's testimony judges don't cry on the record. They calibrate. Alana sat straight, hands folded, voice low. I've read 1,000 reports like his, she said. The nouns change, the adjectives don't. She described the morning in precise lines, the rain, the breath she counted in, the weight of a hand at her wrist, the flash of the seal on paper. I knew the law would have to work without me, she said. That's why I said nothing then, so I could say everything now. A juror asked softly, Were you afraid? Alana held the question, then answered it clean. Yes, I was afraid it would be buried. Not the bruise, the truth. It wasn't drama, it was anatomy. The puzzle assembled Desai closed with structure, not heat. Your job isn't to decide punishment, she said, eyes on the panel. Your job is to decide whether the evidence you've seen, video, metadata, language analysis, witness testimony, meets the low bar of probable cause. She laid out the charges like a blueprint. Assault under color of law, striking a citizen while exercising official authority. Deprivation of rights, using state power to violate constitutional protections. False report, knowingly filing statements contradicted by objective evidence. For Officer Soto, she continued, consider obstruction or false statement tied to the sworn narrative and the private recording. She paused, not for effect, for weight. And for Officer McKee, she said, voice softening, you may consider a lesser false statement count or none at all, based on his cooperation and candor. Justice is not blind to remorse, it's informed by it. The foreperson watched her a long moment, then looked at the panel. They filed out to deliberate. Minutes can stretch like hours when a city holds its breath. Outside, rain began again, light, almost kind. The corridor's fluorescent hum felt like a heartbeat. When the panel returned, no one smiled. No one frowned. They simply carried paper whose ink would change lives. The foreperson read, True bill against Sergeant Daniel Crowley. Assault under color of law, deprivation of rights. Filing a false report. True bill against Officer Brian Soto. Obstruction of justice, false statements to investigators, as charged. No true bill on major counts for Officer Tyler McKee. Referral for administrative discipline and cooperation credit noted. It wasn't triumph. It was a door opening. Outside the sealed room, Desai exhaled into the quiet hallway. Ellison's nod was nearly imperceptible. A tiny permission. We keep going. McKee sat alone on a bench, elbows on knees, face in his hands. Soto stared at nothing, calculating exits that didn't exist. Alana stood a step apart. Not elevated, not diminished, just steady. She wasn't the story's end. She was its witness. Somewhere across town, a union spokesperson drafted a statement about morale and danger. Somewhere else, a mother reread a decades-old police report about her son and saw finally what had been done to him in words. And on a church bulletin board, a flyer went up. Community Forum. What happens next? Because indictments are not justice. They're a promise to try. Behind closed doors, 12 strangers chose to listen. Not to rank, not to status, to evidence. And sometimes, that is how a system begins to recognize itself. Indictments in hand. The case steps into the light. The courtroom doors will open, the rules will change, and for the first time, the officer's story will be tested in full view of the law they claimed to serve. In Chapter 7, we enter the arena, where every word must stand up to oath, and every action must answer to truth. The doors swung open, not the quiet doors of a grand jury room, but the wide public doors of a federal courtroom. Reporters filled the back rows. Sketch artists sharpened their pencils. The air carried the low hum of fluorescent lights and the higher buzz of expectation. On the bench sat Judge Eleanor Pike. Not Alana. Not a familiar face from Barton County. A federal judge brought in from another district. Measured, distant, unshakably calm. She spoke in a voice that turned the room from noise to order. "Good morning. This is the People versus Sergeant Daniel Crowley. All parties present?" They were. Special Prosecutor Priya Desai at the table for the people, a tower of binders and a single legal pad. Across from her, Mark Levin, counsel for Crowley. Tie loosened just enough to look human, not hurried. Between them, the space where truth would have to pass. Opening for the people, Desai stood. She didn't look at cameras or at the gallery. She looked at the jurors, the only audience that mattered. "Good morning," she said steady. "You will see a slap. You will hear a slur. But this case is not about one morning in the rain." She held up a thin folder labeled Giglio. "It is about credibility. It is about 15 years of reports that read like a script. It is about power used as a weapon, then laundered in language." She glanced at Crowley, then back. "You will hear phrases repeated across time. Erratic, furtive movement, officer feared for his life. You will see those words applied to people who look like Judge Alana Brooks. You will see data, video, GPS, and body cam backups, not because technology is dramatic, but because evidence remembers when people forget." A brief pause. Not for theatre, for breath. "By the end of this trial you will see a pattern, and patterns tell the truth." She sat. The room exhaled. Opening for the defense, Levin rose, hand on the back of his chair, voice low, almost confessional. "You will see a slap," he said. "You will hear ugly words. You will feel anger." He turned toward the jury box. "I won't ask you not to feel. I'll ask you to remember. Feeling is not a verdict." He walked 2 steps, stopped, measured. Sergeant Crowley has worn a badge for 15 years. The job isn't a script. It's chaos. It's nights that stretch into each other. It's waking up to sirens in your head. He let that hang a moment. "You will hear about PTSD. You will hear about training that teaches officers to live in the half-second where hesitation kills. And you will hear words, terrible words, spoken by a man under pressure, not thinking, not knowing who stood in front of him." Levin softened. "We are not here to excuse, we are here to explain, and in law, explanation matters." He sat. Crowley stared ahead, jaw tight, eyes hollow. The architecture of proof trials are not movies, they're scaffolds. Desai built hers beam by beam. Exhibit 1, the steps CCTV in real time, then slowed. Crowley's arm rises, Alana's head snaps, papers bloom and scatter, a white explosion against wet stone, a murmur in the gallery cut short by Judge Pike's raised hand. Exhibit 2, the puddle. A single puddle frame, zoomed, the faint emboss of Chambers, a badge face down, lanyard adrift. The jury leaned in without realizing. Exhibit 3, the map 3D reconstruction, angles, distances, speed, an animation that stripped emotion down to vectors and timing. The story was simple. The proof was not. It was deliberate. Use of force expert. Same teacherly calm from the grand jury, now under oath in the light. Proportionality is the measure, he told the jury. Here, no threat cues, hands visible, distance closed by the officer, not the subject. Strike delivered without escalation steps. Conclusion? Desai asked. Unjustified use of force. Levin stood. Captain, you've never stood in Sergeant Crowley's boots? No, the witness said. But physics stands everywhere. A juror wrote that down. Forensic linguist, slides, numbers, context. She showed jurors a distribution chart. Department baseline for furtive movement descriptors is X. Crowley's rate is over 6 times that. Levin rose. People can write similarly because they're trained similarly. Yes, she agreed, which is why we compare within the same training cohort. He is an outlier among outliers. The chart did not raise its voice. It didn't need to. 2 bystanders, one who filmed, one who froze. The woman who deleted her video spoke carefully. I was scared. I uploaded everything automatically. I didn't know it was still there. Her clip played. Tinny audio. The slap's sharp crack. The insult's dull thud. The second witness, an older man, looked at the floor. I wanted to step in, he said. I'm ashamed I didn't. No one judged him. Not out loud. Officer Tyler McKee, uniform crisp, voice not. Desai's questions were lean. Did you see the seal on the paper? Yes. Did you sign a report that used the word erratic? Yes. Was that what you saw? No. Levin stood, softer than before. Officer, you're human. Yes. Afraid? Every day. Of what? Of doing the wrong thing. Of saying the right thing. Levin nodded. Sat. The jury watched McKee leave the stand like a man who had just put down a weight that might still crush him. Officer Brian Soto, eyes hard, words measured. Desai didn't circle. She pounced clean. You recorded a private clip. Your voice said, she'll learn her place. Do you deny that's your voice? Soto looked at the jurors. No. Context? Levin tried. Jokes. Soto said. It was a bad joke. Desai didn't blink. Bad jokes tell the truth when people think no one is listening. Levin redirected. Is there training about officer survival? Yes. About reading threat? Yes. About how quickly a situation can turn? Yes. Thank you. Levin said, as if that closed more than it did. Judges are trained to control rooms. Witness stands demand a different control, of self. Alana took the oath, sat, looked at the jurors like they were the only ones there. Desai kept it spare. Tell us what you experienced. I approached the courthouse. Alana said, I was stopped. I was struck. I was restrained. Her voice did not quaver, but there was a current underneath, felt if not seen. Desai lowered her voice. Were you afraid? Alana did not answer quickly. She let herself feel it again. The cold stone, the cuff bite, the heat on her cheek. She did not look at Crowley. Yes, she said finally. I was afraid of a familiar thing. That the truth would be written as a threat. A juror put a hand to her mouth. Desai nodded. No further questions. Levin approached like a man crossing a river on stones. He knew the danger. Judge Brooks, he began, respectful by instinct, strategic by trade. You know the weight of words. You know the pressure of decisions. I do, she said. Can officers be asked to make life or death calls in moments? They can, she said. Can good people make bad choices under stress? They can, she repeated. Could Sergeant Crowley have mistaken the situation? Not malice. Mistake. Alana held the question. The courtroom held its breath with her. I cannot say what he felt, she answered. I can say what he did, and I can say what it did to me. Levin inclined his head. No more. She stepped down, not triumphant, not broken. Steady. Levin called a department psychologist, talked about cortisol, hypervigilance, the way the brain learns to live in a storm. He called a training officer, showed slides of ambushes, a funeral program with a folded flag. He tried to turn the word fear from an excuse into an explanation. He called Crowley's former partner, a story about a night when Crowley pulled a child from a burning car. Another about a Christmas Eve overdose call, the way he stayed with a panicked mother until the ambulance arrived. Levin wasn't painting a saint. He was humanizing a man the jury wanted to flatten to a single morning. Do not measure a life by one frame. He urged them without saying it. Desai let the humanization stand. Then she narrowed the lens again. To the psychologist? She asked. Does PTSD justify a preemptive strike on a non-threatening subject? No. To the training officer. Does training remove responsibility? No. To the partner. Can a good deed undo a bad act? The witness hesitated. No. The scaffolding remained. Desai rose one last time. No binder now, only that thin giglio folder and the room. You have seen how power protects itself. She began. You have seen how words, erratic, furtive, fear, can be poured over violence like paint over rotten wood. She walked to the monitor, touched the frozen frame of the slap. Law is not a feeling. Law is what we demand of ourselves when feelings run hot. She faced the box. Hold us to the evidence. Hold him to the oath he took. She sat. Levin stood. His voice lowered to something that sounded like a prayer. You carry more than a verdict. He told the jurors. You carry the weight of what it means to be human under pressure. He gestured, wide enough to include the whole room. Don't turn a man into a moment. Don't turn a job into a villain. If you must punish, do it for what the law proves, not for what the crowd demands. He sat. Crowley looked down at his hands as if they were strangers. The jury filed out. The room softened into whispers. Outside, microphones waited like open mouths. Cable chyrons split the country into colors, blue and red, outrage and defense, certainty and whataboutism. In the city's old stone church, Reverend Caleb Turner lit 2 candles. One for truth, one for mercy. He spoke to the gathered, not to inflame, but to steady. Be patient, he said. Demand justice. Reject revenge. We do not become the thing we fight. An older woman squeezed his hand. I want him punished. She admitted, eyes wet. So do I. The Reverend said gently. I also want us whole. Inside the courthouse, Alana sat alone in a witness room. The hum of the vending machine, the taste of stale coffee. She closed her eyes, saw the steps again, heard the slap again, felt the cuffs again. Then she saw the jury. 12 strangers who had watched her hold steady in the storm. She whispered into the quiet. Let the law be stronger than the narrative. The clock moved slow. The city held its breath. A bailiff's shoes clicked down the hall. But not yet. Not tonight. The jury would sleep on it. So would the city. Morning will bring a verdict, and with it, consequences measured in years and wounds measured in trust. In Chapter 8, judgment arrives, and the cost is counted on every side. The jury filed back in. 12 faces, drawn, pale, carrying the weight of nights without sleep. The gallery stilled, reporters poised. Alana in the second row closed her eyes once, then opened them steady. The 4 persons stood, paper in hand, voice trembling only once. We the jury find the defendant, Sergeant Daniel Crowley, guilty of deprivation of rights under colour of law, guilty of assault, guilty of filing a false report. A collective exhale swept the room, like a tide rolling out. We find Officer Brian Soto, guilty of obstruction of justice, with recommendation for suspended sentence. We find Officer Tyler McKee, guilty of false statement, with recommendation of probation based on cooperation. The judge nodded. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Your service is complete. The jurors did not look at Crowley. They looked at the floor, at their hands, at each other. Anywhere but at the man whose career they had just ended. Crowley slumped back. Levin touched his arm. It was like touching stone. Weeks later, the same courtroom held a different silence. Not the tense anticipation of verdict, but the hushed reverence of sentencing. Judge Pike presided, robes heavy with consequence. "This is the moment," she said, "where law meets accountability." A mother stepped forward, her son arrested by Crowley 10 years prior. "Dismissed," she said. "Case thrown out. But my boy lost his scholarship. He lost his faith in the system." Her voice cracked. "No jury gave us back those years." Another man. Stopped, searched, cuffed on his own lawn. "I was told I fit the description. I fit because my skin fit. He made me feel like a suspect in my own life." The words stacked like stones. Each one added weight to the sentence not yet read. Then, Alana. She walked to the podium, slow but unbroken. The room leaned forward. Her voice was calm, deliberate. "Your Honor, this case is not about me. Yes, I was struck. Yes, I was restrained. But the greater injury was not to my cheek or my wrists. It was to trust." She looked at the gallery, rows of ordinary citizens. For years, people walked into this courthouse believing the law would hear them. That belief was assaulted long before I was. This is not about punishment for one man. It is about whether this community can believe in justice again. A pause. Soft, but cutting. "Sentences don't just punish, they teach. I ask the court to teach that trust is sacred." She stepped back, did not look at Crowley, chose instead to look at the rows of people behind him. Levin rose, his voice stripped of polish now, raw. "Your Honor, Daniel Crowley is not a monster. He is a man, a father of 2, a veteran who carried scars we could not see." He spoke of service records, commendations, the child saved from fire. Do not erase a life of service for one collapse. Do not bury him so deep that redemption becomes impossible. He placed his hand flat on the table. Justice is not vengeance. Desai stood, measured. "Your Honor, the defense is right about one thing. Justice is not vengeance." She lifted a folder. "But justice is accountability. And Sergeant Crowley's record is not one collapse. It is a pattern, 15 years long. A pattern where every bruise, every false report, every dismissal whispered the same truth. The system protected him until he struck the wrong victim." She looked straight at the judge. "Today is not about one man's service. It is about whether this court will affirm that no badge is above the Constitution." She sat. The silence hummed like an electric current. The sentence Judge Pike adjusted her glasses. Her words were deliberate. "Sergeant Crowley, you swore an oath to uphold the Constitution. You broke that oath. You dishonored your badge. You harmed not only individuals, but the public's trust." She leaned forward. "Yet this court must also be credible. Sentences must not only punish, they must persuade." She lifted the gavel slightly, then lowered it. "It is the judgment of this court that you serve 12 years in federal prison. Not the maximum, but long enough to serve notice. Power abused is freedom forfeited." She turned to Soto. "Officer Soto, your words, 'caught in jest,' revealed contempt beneath protocol. You are sentenced to 3 years suspended, with 500 hours of community service. Let those you mocked see you serve." To McKee, "Your silence cost truth, but your candor restored some. You are placed on 2 years probation and entered into a federal whistleblower protection program. This court hopes you use your second chance to speak, not to stand by." The gavel struck. Once, twice. Final. Crowley's head dropped, not in defiance, not in rage, but in something closer to collapse. He did not look at the gallery, did not look at Alana. And Alana, she did not look at him. She looked instead at the faces of her community, men and women who had carried stories like hers without the privilege of a microphone. For them, her eyes said. Always for them. Outside, microphones swarmed. Commentators split screens. Some called it justice. Some called it betrayal. The city called it history. And in the quiet of the church basement, Reverend Caleb Turner lit another candle. This is not an ending, he told the people. It is a beginning, because sentences do not heal. They clear the ground, and healing is what we must build together. Because justice always costs, and sometimes the price is not years behind bars, but the fragile trust we fight to restore. The gavel had fallen, sentences spoken, but justice does not end at the courthouse door. In Chapter 9, we follow the ripples, the reforms, the resistance, the reckoning across a system forced to look in the mirror. The gavel had fallen, but the echo didn't stop at the courthouse walls. It rolled outward, into the streets, the precincts, the city itself. A consent decree was signed. The Barton Police Department placed under federal supervision. For the first time in its history, change wasn't optional. It was court-ordered. Training manuals were rewritten. Implicit bias, de-escalation, duty to intervene. Not in theory, mandatory. Body cameras, once shrugged off as fragile tech, were now doubled with redundant cloud storage. No more malfunction excuses. Every frame backed up twice in systems officers couldn't touch. Discipline policies grew teeth. Not just a slap on the wrist, but real consequences. Suspension, demotion, termination. Patterns flagged, not ignored. On the prosecutor's desk, a new binder appeared. Brady Giglio disclosures, lists of officers whose credibility could taint cases. For years, those lists were whispered about. Now they were transparent. If an officer had lied once, the court would know. If bias shadowed their record, the defense could see. Defense attorneys called it overdue. Prosecutors called it inconvenient. Citizens called it necessary. A new early intervention system came online. Algorithms scanned patterns, complaints, force reports, traffic stops. When risk spiked, supervisors got alerts. Not perfect, but a net, designed to catch the Crowleys before they grew too powerful. Once a month, folding chairs filled the high school gym. Town halls, not photo ops, policy. Residents spoke, not just into microphones, but into records officers had to read. A new civilian review board sat across from the chief. Not advisory, with access to files, complaints, disciplinary logs. For the first time, the community could see what was hidden and what was ignored. At midnight, a street vendor leaned against his cart. "I used to get stopped 3 times a week," he told Nora Patel's recorder. "Now, 0. I don't know if it's fear of oversight or respect. Either way, I can sell without looking over my shoulder." A school bus driver spoke at a forum. "My kids used to joke about how many times I'd get pulled over. They don't laugh anymore, because it's not happening." A high school senior raised her hand in class. "My civics teacher asked if we believe the system works. For the first time, I said maybe." But Nora Patel, the journalist who cracked the story, wrote with caution. "Reform is not magic." Her column began. "It's paperwork, budgets, deadlines. Implicit bias workshops cost money. Cloud storage costs more. And early intervention algorithms mean nothing if no one responds to alerts." She reminded readers, "Justice is not a headline. It is a habit, measured not in months, but in years." Some readers accused her of pessimism. Others called it realism. She called it her job. On a Sunday morning, Reverend Caleb Turner lit another candle. The church basement still smelled of coffee and wax. He faced his congregation, some tired, some hopeful. "Do not expect miracles," he said. "Expect work." He let the silence hold. Justice is not lightning from the sky. It is the daily habit of a community. It is showing up at meetings, it is reading the reports, it is teaching our children to demand more, not less. He raised his hands, voice softer now. Miracles fade, habits endure. At home, Alana closed her notebook. On its last page, a line she had written the night before. Justice is not the gavel, it is the echo. She looked out the window at the city lights. They did not sparkle like stars. They hummed like work, unfinished, imperfect, alive. Because one trial did not fix a city, but it forced it to look in the mirror, and once a city sees itself, it can't unsee. The reforms were written, the systems reshaped, but the question lingered. What would endure when the headlines faded? In Chapter 10, we face the legacy, not of a case, but of a city learning to breathe justice as habit, not miracle. The courthouse steps, where it began, where memory still hums in stone. But years had passed, and the echo had become a lesson. In a lecture hall at Barton Law, students leaned forward in their chairs, notebooks open, eyes fixed on Judge Alana Brooks. She didn't speak like a judge, she spoke like a witness. Language can wound, she told them. It can decide guilt before evidence. Words like erratic, furtive, non-compliant, those aren't just adjectives, they're weapons. She wrote them on the board in chalk, then drew a line through each. Lawyers, judges, officers, we all carry a duty to strip language down to truth, because once it's dressed in prejudice, justice never has a chance. The room was silent. Then a hand lifted. Judge Brooks, a young woman asked, when you sat in that defendant's chair, what did you feel? Alana paused, closed her eyes, then opened them with calm. I felt small, she admitted, but I also realized small moments can expose enormous truths. In the back of that same lecture hall sat Tanya Reed, once a clerk, now a graduate student. Her thesis, Judicial Administration and Power Dynamics in Local Courts. She scribbled notes not just for grades, but for a mission. The bruise she saw on Alana's face years ago had never left her memory. Now it was fuel. Her classmates called her relentless. She called it necessary. And Tyler McKee, the young officer who once stayed silent, now wore no badge. He stood in a training center, projector humming. Recruits in uniform watched as he clicked through slides. He told them not about tactics, but about ethics. I once signed a report I didn't believe, he confessed. It haunted me. Silence is complicity. If you see wrong, say it. If you feel fear, admit it. But never, never falsify truth. Some recruits shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded hard. McKee knew not all would listen. But if even one did, the cost of his probation would feel lighter. And then, behind concrete walls, sat Daniel Crowley. Not in power, not in uniform, but in a narrow cell with time as his only company. At first he scrawled complaints, about food, about guards, about injustice. But slowly, letters changed. One to a grandmother he'd once slammed against a car, another to a young man he'd cuffed without cause. I don't ask forgiveness, he wrote. I ask that you know. I finally see what I refused to. The letters weren't absolution. They were fragments, proof that recognition, however late, is still human. One morning, Alana walked again toward Barton County Courthouse. The air was cool, no rain this time, just sunlight breaking through. She carried no briefcase, only a hand brushing absently across her cheek, where the bruise had once bloomed. Now just a faint scar, a reminder. No officer stepped in her way, no hand rose to strike. She paused on the steps, looked up at the sky, exhaled, and for the first time in years the stone beneath her feet felt like ground, not battlefield. Reforms had been written, oversight enforced, habits reshaped. But more than policy. It was memory that endured. A slap meant to diminish one woman had forced an entire city to confront itself. Students studied it. Clerks built careers on it. Officers trained differently because of it. Even a man in prison whispered its lesson to the walls. Because legacies are not carved in marble. They live in practice. In the way a vendor isn't stopped at midnight. In the way a bus driver greets children without fear of flashing lights. In the way a judge steps onto her courthouse steps and keeps walking, uninterrupted. Alana touched the rail as she climbed, paused just once more. Only a slap. She thought, but the echo may last years. The story of Barton County did not end with a verdict or a sentence. It ended with a scar, not to erase the pain, but to remind every generation that justice, once tested, must be kept alive. And sometimes the smallest strike can carry the loudest legacy. Justice is not the volume of the gavel, it is the clarity of truth, the discipline of process, and the courage of those who refuse to let silence bury what happened. One slap on courthouse steps exposed more than one officer. It revealed how words can be bent, how systems can look away, and how fear can be written into reports as if it were fact. But it also revealed something else, that when truth is documented, preserved, and spoken out loud, it can force a city, even a nation, to change. Justice does not arrive as thunder. It arrives in habits, in body cams that cannot be erased, in review boards that can finally see, in officers taught to intervene instead of to hide, and in ordinary citizens, vendors, bus drivers, students, who walk their streets with one less shadow of suspicion. The echo of that morning still lingers, not in the bruise on a judge's cheek, but in the lessons etched into law, training, and conscience. That echo belongs to all of us. So if you see injustice, remember it. If you can, record it. If you cannot, tell it. And above all, stand together. Because power isolates, but truth multiplies when shared. The system changes only when people refuse to let the story end where the report does. If this story touched you, leave your thoughts below. Tell us what resonated. Tell us what case should be told next. Because we will keep telling these stories. Not until justice is perfect, but until justice becomes habit. Black voice matter. Stories of power. Stories of truth. Stories that refuse to be silent.